one of the few things that I can actually see eye to eye with when it comes to Mark Zuckerberg. And I think there might not be as much overlap as this video might think you might see in him and I. But I find it very interesting when I stumbled upon an article as I was reading my daily dose of different things on the internet. I like to do a lot of research when it comes to geopolitics, current events, pop culture, as it is understood when it comes to the soft power that pop culture provides, and also just because I enjoy to listen to some of the pop culture as much as I complain, and will complain about some of the worst parts of it. There are some silver linings, in my opinion, and I also have an interest as well in politics, and I think that those things all overlap in the article that I found, which was covering Mark Zuckerberg's obsession with Augustus Caesar. And I think that what might seem to some as some esoteric historical figure is actually very crucial when it comes to understanding the concepts that drive Western civilization, as it is known, and what drives Western Europe and America when it comes to foreign policy, its geopolitical outlook, and also just how it operates politically. And if you're someone like me, who I used to be a poli-sci major, now I'm more into international relations, I'd like to eventually be a professor in Byzantine studies, but I digress. This video really isn't about me, but I want to just give you kind of a little bit of a insight on where I'm at. But I find Augustus Caesar to be a personally fascinating figure and someone I was already pretty aware of when it comes to who he was. He was the nephew of Julius Caesar, and he originally was named Gaius Octavius Thurinus, and eventually he gained the name of Gaius Julius Caesar as his uncle adopted him upon passing. And when you're adopted in ancient Rome, you actually can, in order to inherit the estates of that person who adopted you, you had to actually be willing to take their name, and he took the name of Gaius Julius Caesar, and he was able to then gain the loyalty of veterans who fought in Gaul and across the different campaigns that Caesar had done until he was assassinated, Julius Caesar, in the Ides of March. And he was able to, Augustus Caesar, become the first Roman emperor. A lot of people think that Julius Caesar was one of the first Roman emperors, when in reality he was a dictator. And historiography puts him as being part of the Roman Republic, although there was not that much night and day between the early Principate and the late Republic when it comes to the initial transition, which was gradual. And Augustus Caesar was the one who really formally set those boundaries when it comes to what we define today as the Roman Republic. And then after Augustus Caesar takes power, and after the Battle of Actium, where he successfully defeats Mark Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra from Egypt, who was one of the last rulers from the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Hellenistic dynasty that ruled over Egypt since Alexander passed away, and his companion Ptolemy I, who became Soter, the savior, and the first of many Hellenistic monarchs to rule over Egypt until 27 BC. Rome annexed Egypt thanks to Augustus, and because of all of the wealth, which I will talk about in another video, why Rome and Egypt fell and why it was so important to begin with when it comes to the Roman Empire, as someone who's interested in Roman history. Augustus really afterwards, he would make very much good use of the power that he had, and would show actually to a degree that you can have a functionally autocratic figure, and if he actually has good intentions and is actually competent, intelligent, and understands the limits. He actually was one of the emperors that thought that after he finished conquering different territories, such as the rest of Hispania, parts of the Balkans where Illyricum is, and also obviously Egypt and much of what was the remaining hinterlands near North Africa, making the Roman Empire look more like the map minus Britannia, which was annexed by one of his successors in Claudius, who was a descendant of his, and was a part of the wider Julio-Claudio dynasty, which was the first dynasty of emperors. And the Roman emperor really wasn't a monarch, at least not in the sense that most people at the time, and even today, associate a monarch with being. It wasn't until the later Roman Empire that the title of Basileus, which was the Greek term king at the time, became associated synonymously with that of emperor. In fact, the Roman emperors, even afterwards and before, primarily used the Imperator Caesar Augustus, which was the name of Augustus, actually. Augustus means in Latin the increaser, or the venerable, and it was basically synonymous with the emperor and was added to his name once he became emperor of the Roman Empire. And this was actually a tradition. If you actually look at manuscripts from the the Middle Ages, where during I think the 14th or 13th century, there is a manuscript of Augustus Caesar, but he is anachronistically depicted as looking like Manuel II Paleologos, who was a Byzantine emperor that's still conscious of the Roman legacy and still identifying as Roman, despite really being more of a Greek state at the time. The title of Augustus was still used and is portrayed as such, as Augustos, which is the term in Greek, or translated as Sebastos. And I think that all of this really is why I'm just telling you all this esoteric stuff, is to keep in mind that a lot of the Western countries today, even the language of English, are adaptations and evolutions of states that came after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. And that includes England, France, or the United Kingdom today, France, and not all the United Kingdom, mostly England and parts of Scotland, Ireland, and I think the other areas, such as maybe Wales too. Some areas they didn't take over all of them. There were definitely native tribes that ended up outlasting the Romans. And actually, when it comes to conquering Britain, at the time, it was actually a net loss. Egypt was really the province that allowed Rome, thanks to Augustus's conquest, to finance the majority of their empire's, fiscal expenses when it comes to the yearly taxes that needed to be used, which, unlike today when we have modern monetary theory, like what our government's doing during the coronavirus, they had a gold standard and they couldn't just print money willy-nilly from some ancient version of the Fed. But I digress. Augustus Caesar is very important because of the fact that to the 20th century, there were empires that still used the names such as Caesar or Kaiser, or not Kaiser, or Czar, which was the German and Russian respective forms of Caesar, which was Augustus Caesar's one of his cognomens. And when it comes to how our civilization, Western civilization, as I am an American who was raised, I'm South Korean, but I was raised here in the United States, and as someone, I guess, who has been westernized to a degree, along with many people living in the United States, I think it is helpful to understand history, and it'll better explain how, sorry about that, we are at the point where we're at, and the nature of the political systems that govern our society, and not just having this ostensible outlook on them that's more reflective of a class in school, in the U.S. education system, for example, which is just so compressed and obscures the very interesting and stunning nature of the truth when it comes to historical events. And I think that truth itself is something that is not even 100% ascertainable, considering the limits on historical sources and the biases of historians at the time. We are really at the mercy of mostly a lot of guesswork and scholars who study these things, which I'm aspiring to be one, who dedicate their lives to the further understanding and decoding of what actually happened. And obviously, due to the source limitations, that's not easy. It's not like you're just reading exact versions. They didn't have YouTube videos or anything like that where we could 100% verify some of this. A lot of this is word of mouth, hearsay, and historians sometimes, unfortunately, with an axe to grind or a political or religious bias, but that's just the human condition, as it is on social media today. It's like that when it comes to history and how it's recorded. We're all biased to an extent. We're just choosing whether we're being honest about our biases when it comes to our discourse with people. And some people are more honest than others in that. And I hope to be more in the latter camp of being honest than not so. And I think when it comes to Augustus Caesar, he even has been largely described as someone who put the mask on by Edward Gibbon, actually, if you've read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and never really took it off, forgot to take it off. And the mask kind of became who he was, in the sense that he seemed in his personal life to contradict a lot of the things he would put into his political reforms, like banning adultery, which he did himself, and also setting up these moral laws that he himself would, on a personal level growing up, clearly not have been inclined to have done, and probably would have been punished if having to be an equal subject to the laws, which he claimed, and the Republic claimed, much like the United States does when it comes to the Constitution today. But obviously, just like with America, Rome and many countries, even to this day, have two-tier justice systems. One for us, the masses, and then the other for the well-connected and the wealthy and powerful. But, listen, that's just reality. Complaining about it doesn't do very much. I'm going to complain a lot in other videos on that, but it's more helpful just to, more than just complain, understand why we're in the situation we're in instead of just railing against it, having a firm historical understanding and realizing that Augustus Caesar, for example, has way more of an impact today than you would think so. And a lot of people might assume, oh, this guy was around 2,000 years ago. He died in 14 AD. He was alive around the time when the historical Jesus of Nazareth was alive. Whether he was son of God or a philosopher or whatever, I think he's personally a philosopher. But when it comes to him being around, which is considered a very long time ago, and think about this, in between, Islam was spawned in 630 in the 620s by the Prophet Muhammad at the time of Islam. And all these other religions came and went. The end of polytheism, all this other stuff. There has been this grand transition. And to this day, actually, a lot of Western civilization has subconsciously or even consciously, to the more intelligent and self-aware of the people in the government, they have continued the imperial legacy in more ways than just the ostensible. And if you look at, for example, the concept of the Roman Empire being the Respublica, or the public affair, it never stopped being called formally the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic. The Roman Empire is really a historiographic term. They refer to it as an empire more in the sense that it was an imperial republic. And that is in the sources described by historians, for example, which obviously might have some biases, but clearly, whether it was a reality or not, Rome was conscious of its legacy and wanted to at least ostensibly come off as, to its citizens at least, being a republic, having the grain annona up until the loss of Egypt and North Africa, for example, in both Rome, the new and the old Rome, respectively. And also, since the days of the Republic, there were a lot of vestiges during the transition from late antiquity to the Middle Ages, such as the grain bill. Those things disappeared over time, also such as the consulship and the formal powers of the Senate, becoming nothing more than what Procopius in Gibbon's Decline and Fall described as just, portraits of what seems like, just like what the Senate should be looking like, but in reality, they had no power. And in a lot of ways, the mediocrity of the Senate back then reminds me a lot of the Senate today. The government today, and to many states also in the West, along with a lot of states in the East as well, there's a lot of contradictions when it comes to these standards and what we're defining as just and competent. People seem to be few and far in between, and they're mostly not the ones at the top. We're mostly governed by corrupt people who are largely self-interested and serve corporate interest, but, that's just my opinion, and maybe you're inclined to disagree. But I think we can all agree that Augustus Caesar was the one who really began the conscious rejection of not being ostensibly considered a monarch. When the Roman Republic was originally replaced by the empire at the time, the edicts that Augustus sent out had tried to make it seem like the Republic was restored. And it was restored in everything. It wasn't restored in anything but name. That's what I was trying to say. And the reality was at the time that what he was doing was largely unconstitutional. He was interfering in trials that should have not had anything to do with him, such as the Caepio conspiracy. He also tended to be elected consul way more times consecutively than what was the precedent before. And then he also was able to appoint certain praetors and people in the positions of government, stacking the bureaucracy with, loyalists and people who were probably sycophants. That's not very Republican-ish, unless you're trying to consider that to be like the Republic we have today, which is pretty much the case. But the reality is the Roman Republic, just like the United States, to a degree, had always been, in a lot of ways, an oligarchy where the people at top, the landed elite, the aristocrats, in whatever variation, whether you're talking about the Silicon Valley types and the old guard, which still have influence today, or whether you're talking about in China with the CCP, their families, and the Russians with the oligarchs, which obviously have sway around Putin and obviously have his ears and also are vital when it comes to Putin maintaining his control over the different regions that otherwise would not have any incentive to listen or have any sort of political unity with the broader Russian state. This is just geopolitics. And I think that it's not something that I came up with. It's just the reality when you start studying these things. And I think that's why geopolitics is not only important, but the figures which drove the policies of these states historically and consciously or unconsciously have been still factors in how these states are governed today. If you guys don't know, there was a good video the Caspian Report made, which was about France's neo-colonial empire, which still economically, not politically, at least in public, controls and has dominance and an unfair amount of exploitative capacity when it comes to the affairs of most of the West African nations, such as the Ivory Coast. And the French actually were greatly involved when it came to NATO ousting Gaddafi in 2011 from Libya, along with the United States under Obama and other NATO countries which were inclined to do so. But the reality is, when it comes to these different conflicts abroad and whatnot, they are framed much differently when it comes to how the mainstream press and the government tends to portray them as. They tend to portray them as these like liberating efforts from the democratic West to ensure that the stability of these countries is maintained, and that these awful dictators, many of which we originally, or the United States and many of the Western countries originally supported until they mostly went rogue. And the reality is there's a lot of hypocrisy, obviously, with that. But it takes very little just digging to understand and really see that the mask is very, very thin. And at the time of Augustus being in power, many people clearly probably saw how much he overstepped his boundaries. But his propaganda machine, much like the propaganda devices of today's political elites, are more powerful than I think most people, even the people who are trying to better understand the truth on the internet, than most of these people are willing to give it credit for, as just seen by the fact that we are now having a presidential election, which I'll get into in another video about my opinions on Bernie Sanders dropping out, but one where we have two really old, just delusional, just bad options when it comes to President Trump and Biden. And I think both of them, I'm not voting for either, are both pretty mediocre choices and are reflective of the dysfunction of our political system, which in a lot of ways mirrors the Roman Republic and also parts of the Athens when it comes to our naval supremacy, the United States militarily being the naval hegemon of the world, controlling access to both the Atlantic and Pacific, and with no contest pretty much. The Chinese really are trying to, but in future videos I'll talk about how the coronavirus, despite China's best efforts, is going to damage them in the long term more than most people really see at the time. And they're desperately trying to hide that, but clearly they're not the best. And they're definitely stage managing a little bit better than the U.S. The U.S.'s response, the government here, has been mediocre for really just the fact that we could have prepared even. I think that has to do with Trump, Obama, and just the U.S. government as a whole. I think that many people tend to blame either the Democrats or the Republicans, when at the end of the day, these parties are just meaningless differential labels that are supposed to just seem like they're here for the options of choice when it comes to the fact and how they govern. If you look at them when they've both been in power recently, it's very obvious that there's very little night and day. And the handful of insurgents are actual outsiders who have interesting and maybe unique political perspectives. They're few and far between. And unfortunately, they're nowhere in a position yet to even be able to enact the changes that we need. And the policies really reflect that. We've had this current stimulus, which obviously is nothing more than a corporate bailout with breadcrumbs and scraps to the regular people of the country, the average American citizen. And that's a shame. And I think that in future videos, I'll definitely talk about that more. But the reality is, we live in a country which often brands itself as a free country, as a democratic republic, as a constitutional republic, or something along those lines. These fancy terms are really just things that are existent in the realm of principle. And when it comes to the real life day-to-day practices, ask most who are concerned, who have dealt with people from the government, it very much of the time is not a pleasant experience. And it also usually tends to be one, unless you're connected and powerful, that is not very reflective of having a system where these people are supposed to be public servants. They're usually living in their estates in either DC or the states that they're from, and they are mostly out of touch and living in their own bubbles, surrounded by bureaucrats, consultants, aides, all these different people, security, that make them completely unapproachable and completely distant and undisinterested in the actual plights of day-to-day Americans when it comes to our healthcare, when it comes to the uninsured Americans in healthcare, the people struggling, 55%, who are living paycheck to paycheck, or a lot of them now due to the coronavirus are probably underwater. And the just homelessness crisis across the country, the cultural just disintegration of anything that really has a meaning to it, the abandonment of the worthwhile traditions, and the just, I don't know, just like when it comes to the worst elements of the past and the worst elements of what the future could be, it seems like they're just blending together to form just what we have today. And it doesn't really have to be that way, but we have to be able to realize that just because people call it one thing and they're wearing suits and ties and they're pretending to seem like, because they went to this fancy Ivy League school or elite school and were able to just have these jobs that because of their connections they have. And that's good for them. Listen, at the end of the day, if you are fortunate enough to be born in those positions, more power to you. I think that at the end of the day, we don't want to blame. We can blame people for their actions, but the system itself is the problem. And I think that the sooner we stop talking about individual people and start collectively debating and trying to enact ways to implement policies that are substantive and not just cliches, platitudes, and meaningless, cynical just use of just like either identity politics or just like, I don't know, just religion or any of these things that we really could be moving past. And we can keep a lot of these things private. And at the end of the day, focus on actually making this country truly great. I mean, the way that Trump claims he wants to do. And then like the fact that Joe Biden wants to go back to, the Obama era. And I think all these people have convinced themselves, and even just everyone, most of society, that we live in this free country. And I think the Romans at the time, maybe the ones that were too distant from power, who weren't paying attention, maybe they thought they truly lived in a respublica. I'm sure the ones who got the grain and nona appreciated the grain and nona, the free grain and wine, and the reenactments of cool battles in the Colosseum and the entertainment. But that is window dressing. And the breads and circus thing is called that as a negative derision, not just some positive thing. And maybe we can be in favor of policies that are more humane, that give people more access and give people more access to the resources they need to actually have an equal opportunity, just a genuine meritocracy. But at the same time, we don't want these things to just become distractions or the breadcrumbs that are thrown at us as the people who actually are controlling the levers of power are making policies that are truly against our best interests as American citizens and as people who want to actually be peaceful and prosperous, and not just for those who are at the very top, but everybody, from every place. And I don't think we need to have an exploitative society that we like the ones that we have. And the idea, just like Augustus Caesar called it the republics, and any Roman emperor would have said this was the republic, even clearly it was that just a name. We continue to refer to the West as this democratic society broadly, not just the United States, but even Western Europe, such as the French and the British, when the reality is during World War II, if you look at the Allies and the Axis, a lot of the countries in the Allied side, such as the Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek, who I think had some positive traits, but was in some ways, there was a lot of corrupt local officials and a lot of plights, and more so with the British and the French in the sense that they both had colonial empires. And while maybe they had democracy, just like they have protectionism today in their own countries, like they're rallying for more and more, like I think the Americans should be. But we shouldn't be depriving it from the other countries so that they can enact their own policies and have control over their own political affairs. We should take national sovereignty as not just this thing we say and then just, completely act against that interest, but actually provide it towards, the world. I think that that's something that is an admirable thing that we claim that we do in principle, but in practice just doesn't seem like it equals into the policies that inform our reality for what it is, and that's for better and for worse. And I think mostly for worse. And if you look at the democracy that these countries even had in the 20th century, as they were developing more egalitarian societies, that was for the ones who were in the country, who were insulated. A good story that I actually learned was one when I learned about Ho Chi Minh, who you can have plenty of criticism for him as being someone who was communist in some ways, in ways, and also probably just at the time, obviously a state enemy. But I think that there's a lot to be learned about him. I think he was very charismatic and an interesting figure who clearly was intelligent. And I think that his reaction to visiting Paris and assuming that he could possibly reason with the French and maybe get a more just cooperation and non-exploitative relationship that wasn't French colonialism, he clearly was obviously mistaken. And I think it's obviously heartbreaking that he assumed that he would have been able to convince these people when the reality is this entire system, just like the one we have here in the United States, is contingent on geopolitical hegemony, and that inevitably requires, to some degree, the exploitation of people in developing countries, whether it be controlling the people who are in the driver's seat of their political policy, or whether it's just, here at home, just ensuring that all these jobs are outsourced, and that instead of giving people respectable jobs, these companies that are using public resources here and refusing to mostly pay taxes or an equal fair share of taxes are offshoring most of their resources and assets and their income, revenue, whatnot. And then they're paying pennies on the dollar or even less to developing countries' people who are just getting to the point where they have their own industrial revolution, and we're exploiting and influencing and manipulating their politics to immiserate them, and also just guarantee that here in the United States and in other Western countries, we have cheap, free consumer goods, which are pleasant. I have plenty of myself. We've all benefited from it. And that's why I'm conscious that at the end of the day, I'm not going to fault people for being involved with this system. I never really bothered until I got older to really start looking into a lot of this stuff and understanding the system and trying to figure out ways that where we can look and maybe change our perspective and possibly pursue a better way of doing things for everyone. And that's something that I think is what most people in the country, and that's why the struggle really is real. I don't think that the actual people in these countries are bad people. That's both on the Trump side, and that's both when it comes to the people who support Biden. I think a lot of them are misguided, maybe. I think some of them have false illusions, or they are more politically interested in pursuing politically savvy tactics. But at the end of the day, I think we should not try to compromise core principles. And I think that at the end of the day, we need to start setting some better standards for ourselves. We need to start actually honoring the meaningful traditions that have been left from the forefathers of the country. And I think that at the same time, we can enfranchise those who are here and ensure that they actually have a reason to be proud to be an American, and actually have, an incentive to other countries to maintain the reputation that largely is just a form of propaganda, that this is the land of opportunity. This can be the land of opportunity again, as it was for some people in the 20th century. And it could be an land of opportunity for more people who are confident and are willing to contribute and have ambitions, and are people that, are capable of not just having huge amounts of money in their bank account, but are actually people that demonstrate traits that are, positive and admirable, heroic maybe, and even in the most extreme cases. I think we can try to create a better society where we're all trying to move forward, but at the same time not forget about the past and learn from it. And I think learning from Augustus Caesar, learning from people like Mark Zuckerberg, who in a lot of ways I think is a technocrat and someone who definitely shouldn't be president, but I wouldn't be surprised if he ran and possibly won. We have a mediocre political system right now. And I think that looking back at other figures and trying to draw parallels, obviously not everything's going to be precise, but contrasting the events of people who existed before us is actually very helpful, I think, in the sense that human nature has never really changed. And that's a good and a bad thing, in the sense that it's basically a new day, just and the same shit. It's different people, languages, cultures, and faces, and people in charge with different types of dreams and ambitions and settings. But when it comes to, if you assess this like it's a grand chessboard, or maybe just in a way a story, in a way that Shakespeare maybe would look at it, that all the world's a stage, and the characters, the people, the leaders, they have their entrances and exits. I think I butchered that, but you get the idea. And when it comes to how most people have lived their lives historically, I think the best slave, as Johann Van Gogh once said, is the one who thinks he's free. And I think that it's tragic that that's true, but we are all mostly as slaves to our own desires and slaves to this system that really does not have any of our true best interest. And that's only exemplary in the sense that our options are Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and that I am talking to you right now about Augustus Caesar and Mark Zuckerberg, and why Mark Zuckerberg's haircut sometimes looks like Augustus Caesar, and why this nerdy dude who I think dropped out of Harvard thinks that he's even in any way comparable to Augustus Caesar. Don't get me wrong, Zuckerberg's a smart guy, but I think Facebook is just, as it is at the end of the day, a large and successful platform. But it doesn't mean that, like Augustus Caesar created an order that in some form or another despite evolving from principate to dominant to what we now refer to as the Byzantine era or the late Roman period. We can see that the state itself was very conscious of the precedents that Augustus set, and that in many ways, whether you're talking about the month of August or people named Augusta, like the daughter, I think, of Zuckerberg and his wife, and whether you talk about July, obviously, Julius Caesar, or we talk about a lot of the things that are just part of our culture, the American culture, that if you're like me and live in the United States, are constantly being interacted and interfaced with, but are a lot of times by many unconsciously not being appreciated and understood for what they are. And unfortunately, misrepresentations tend to dictate and ruin the best of things. But hopefully this video was of some value, because I think that the topic, and I think Augustus Caesar himself, as much as I probably could have talked about him more, if you want to learn more about him, there'll be a link in the description below. This video wasn't meant to be a biography. It was just meant to be more of a diatribe, and why I think that Mark Zuckerberg's interest in Mark Zuckerberg, and no, he obviously is interested in himself. He's an egomaniac, but why he likes Augustus Caesar, which I actually think he is an interesting figure. Not one that I would want to emulate, but one that I think we need to understand if we are able to understand modern political systems in the West and what the true nature of Western civilization is, and then how we can change it in the West as much as we know the truth. We don't want to just act like that's it and be nihilistic. We can learn from the mistakes of the past, bring with us to the future the best things that deserve to be preserved, and then for the things that really were holding us back, lift the shackles, take them off, and hopefully, metaphorically and literally, have a better future. And I think that starts with understanding events from the past. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and let me know what you think. If you disagree with anything that I said, I'm curious to hear what you think. I'll make more videos in the future, and hopefully then, they're not over 30 minutes, but I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully this was about 32 minutes well spent. Peace out.